1933, January 1st. The great gleaming lie of the interwar years was that the submarine threat had been solved. In the hushed wood-panelled halls of the Admiralty, naval planners reviewed the grim lessons of 1917. That was the year the U-boat had brought the United Kingdom to the very brink of starvation. Yet, the conviction that the threat was neutralized was stronger than the memory of near defeat. Budgets were constrained. The choices made reflected a rigid, outdated definition of naval power. For every single pound spent on the necessary, ugly business of anti-submarine warfare, the development of ASDIC, the construction of small, expendable escort vessels, the crucial escort vessel, the workhorse required to police a 3,000-mile supply line, was deemed a strategic afterthought. Obsessed with grand fleet actions, the Admiralty scrapped older destroyers, believing they were simply too costly to maintain. This left the nation critically short of the very numbers they would soon desperately need. Meanwhile, across the North Sea, the Reich was systematically dismantling the constraints of the Versailles Treaty. Beginning in 1922, the German High Command used foreign design bureaus as a smokescreen. They were drawing up blueprints and mastering the dark art of submarine construction. When the treaty restrictions were openly renounced, the groundwork for a massive U-boat fleet was already complete. This fleet was poised for rapid expansion under the tactical genius of Karl Donitz. The Allies were already lagging dangerously behind. New ship classes took 15 to 18 months just to move from blueprint to sea. New weapons took even longer. The technology they relied upon was primitive and deeply misunderstood. ASDIC, the great hope of detection, was a fragile, temperamental tool. Its beam, sound travelling through the volatile Atlantic water, bent and distorted like light through a flawed lens. It yielded false echoes from fish, from wrecks, and from tide rips. The operators struggled constantly with the noise of their own ship's propellers. Worse still, the crucial lack of depth indication meant they could find a target, but rarely know how far down it was hiding. The duralumin domes protecting the transducers corroded within months, demanding constant, debilitating maintenance. The grim reality of Britain's escort fleet was visible in the aging hulls of the V and W class destroyers. These were vessels born of the previous war. They were strong, certainly, but they were utterly exhausted. In the damp chill of a Scottish dockyard, the crew of the converted destroyer HMS Van Ock wrestled with this legacy. The V and Ws were being transformed into long-range escorts, or LREs. This desperate modification involved ripping out a boiler and converting the empty space into a fuel tank. This boosted their endurance to 2,780 miles, enough to reach the mid-Atlantic. But it slashed their top speed to a sluggish 24 knots. Below decks, the conditions were atrocious. The mess decks, inadequately insulated and barely heated, were perpetually clammy. Seawater, driven by the ceaseless motion of the Atlantic, found every weakness in the hull. Leaks plagued the forecastle, dripping cold brine onto the sleeping hammocks and, critically, contaminating the fuel tanks. The coal-fired galleys were obsolete, filling the cramped spaces with smoke and grime. Leading seaman Arthur Davies, wiping the condensation from a steel bulkhead, felt the ship's low freeboard keenly. Even tied up in port, the deck felt constantly ready to ship a green sea. The stability was poor, and the shallow draft was a critical handicap for anti-submarine warfare operations. This limited the placement and effectiveness of their depth charges. They were elderly tubs, as the sailors bitterly nicknamed them. They were destined for the grueling, endless patrols of the Arctic and the Atlantic, a role for which they were never designed. The men, many reservists or national service youth who had never seen the sea, had to learn their trade on these leaky, shuddering vessels. They were preparing to face a U-boat menace that was faster, deeper, and far more numerous than the planners had ever predicted. The slow pace of developing new weapons meant they would fight the opening battles of the war with tools barely improved since 1918. By the summer of 1930, the foundations for the inevitable conflict were tragically laid. On one side lay a technological deficit and a fleet of aging, poorly equipped escorts. On the other, a rapidly expanding, highly trained U-boat force. The only protection Britain had ready was an organizational structure, painstakingly developed by men like Admiral James and Paymaster Rear Admiral Sir Eldon Manistee. This structure was the convoy system. The Admiralty had stated its policy clearly. The convoy system is considered the most effective form of protection. Manistee had toured the world in 1938, setting up the complex organization needed to shepherd the world's trade. But organization was just theory. The test would come not in a planning room, but in the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Atlantic. There, the courage of the merchant seamen and the resilience of these hastily prepared escorts would determine the very survival of the nation. On September 3, 1930, as war was declared, the sinking of the passenger liner Athenia by U-30 provided the immediate bloody signal that the battle had begun. This event set the convoy organization into motion, demanding that these ill-prepared men and ships sail into the long, dark shadow of the U-boat threat. The war at sea began not with a grand naval engagement, but with a series of quick, brutal humiliations. These acts ripped the mask of pre-war confidence from the Admiralty. The strategic miscalculation that the submarine threat was neutralized became a death warrant for thousands. Within weeks of the Athenia sinking, the German U-boats proved they were not merely predators of merchantmen. On September 17, 1939, U-29 sighted the aircraft carrier HMS Courageous. The carrier was patrolling without the close escort that had been removed by strategic misjudgment. 4 torpedoes slammed into the carrier's side. The massive vessel capsized within 15 minutes, taking 518 men with her. The shockwave of the loss resonated throughout the fleet. The submarine was not just a nuisance, it was clearly a primary threat to capital ships. But the audacity of the German fleet reached its zenith on the night of October 14, 1939. Lieutenant Commander Günther Prien, in U-47, executed a daring infiltration of Scapa Flow. This was supposedly the impenetrable main anchorage of the home fleet. Navigating the submerged blockships and strong currents, Prien slipped into the vast, silent harbour. He found the battleship HMS Royal Oak lying carelessly at anchor. The attack was swift and terrifying. Prien fired 3 torpedoes. The first misfired, the second 3 struck home. The Royal Oak shuddered under the blows, taking on water instantly. The infiltration was so unexpected that the crew was slow to react, many believing the explosions to be internal accidents. The battleship rolled quickly, her vast bulk turning upside down in the icy water within 13 minutes. The Sank, taking 833 men and boys with her. The sinking was a psychological victory for Germany and a profound strategic failure for Britain, confirming that the threat was immediate and severe. Yet, even as Donitz's U-boats racked up victory after victory, they were fighting with flawed weapons. The advanced German torpedoes suffered from critical depth-keeping problems, often running too deep by up to 3.7 meters. They were passing harmlessly beneath their targets. Their magnetic pistol, the MZ, was a crippling liability. It was so sensitive it could trigger prematurely from minor maneuvers or magnetic anomalies in the water. This technical flaw momentarily mitigated the carnage. But could anyone truly grasp how much worse the battle might have been? Regardless, it did little to reassure the men sailing the Atlantic. The critical defensive strategy, the convoy system, was quickly put in place, forcing independent vessels into the relative safety of escorted groups. But the Admiralty, influenced by Churchill, fell for the old fallacy that escorting convoys was inherently defensive. They preferred the illusory glory of offensive hunting groups. This was a strategy akin to sending cavalry against a hidden sniper. This folly was exposed by the sheer scale of the Atlantic. It was 3,000 miles of ocean, where ASDIC's effective range was barely a mile. Then came the hammer blow. That was the fall of France in June 1940. The map of the war changed overnight. U-boats no longer faced the long, punishing transit from German ports through the North Sea. Now, the French bases of Brest, Lorient, and Saint-Nazaire provided immediate access to the western approaches. The ply lines were drastically shortened, extending the U-boat's effective time on station by an estimated 25%. The ratio of boats in maintenance to those operational dropped sharply. What had been a dangerous struggle instantly became the darkest hour. The U-boats, now operating in wolf packs, poured into the undefended Atlantic. Their effectiveness was amplified by the unseen weapon of Bedienst, the German code-breaking service. This service was successfully reading British naval ciphers. Admiral Donitz knew precisely where the convoys were going. The consequences were immediate and catastrophic. In mid-October 1940, the Wolfpack, guided by German intelligence, fell upon convoys SC-7 and HX-79. The escorts were tragically thin, often just a single destroyer or sloop, protecting dozens of merchant ships. The crews themselves were reservists and national service youths, many still finding their sea legs. On the bridge of the aging destroyer, the wind whipped the salt spray into the faces of the crew. They were protecting a vast, sprawling collection of tankers and freighters. Their speed was set at a painful 8 or 9 knot slow passages that made them perfect targets. The night was moonless, visibility almost zero. Below decks, the ASDIC operator, hunched over his flickering screen, struggled to cut through the noise. The Type 112 set, the backbone of their anti-submarine warfare capability, offered only a narrow beam and a slow search rate. He knew the limitations: false echoes, beam bending, the agonizing lack of depth indication. He was searching a 3-dimensional world with a 2-dimensional tool. Then the explosions began. The U-boats, using their superb passive listening hydrophones, the GHG set, had detected the convoy long before the escort's active sonar could find them. The Germans, masters of the night surface attack, slipped into the convoy's columns, firing from within the mass of ships. The sound was deafening, the tearing metal, the roar of burning oil, the high, desperate whistles of steam escaping ruptured boilers. In the space of a few days, the wolf packs sank 11 merchant ships from HX-72 and devastated SC-7 and HX-79. U-boats at sea were sinking between 500 and 1,000 tons per day each. Monthly sinkings regularly exceeded 200,000 tons. The desperation led to frantic shipbuilding. The Flower-class corvettes, based on a whale-catcher design, were rushed into existence. These 940-ton vessels were cheap and fast to build, but they were hell to inhabit. On board HMS Celandine, a newly commissioned Flower, the crew of 55 men shared a space roughly 22 by 30 feet. The lack of thermal insulation and poor ventilation meant condensation was perpetual. Everything dripped. The air was heavy with the smell of wet wool, diesel, and sickness. The ship was notoriously lively in a seaway, prone to rolling violently even in a light chop. The bitter joke was that a Flower would roll on wet grass. The galley was located aft, meaning every meal, from the thin soup to the hard-won duff for pudding, had to be carried across the open well deck. That deck was constantly swept by green seas. Sailors risked being knocked off their feet, or worse, swept overboard, just to deliver cold food to the forecastle mess. The cramped, unsanitary conditions bred sickness, leading to a high incidence of tuberculosis. Yet these were the ships that had to keep the lifeline open. Recognizing the desperate shortage, the British government accepted the transfer of 50 aging Town-class destroyers from the United States in exchange for bases. When they arrived, they were a catalogue of faults. Corroded rivets allowed seawater into fuel tanks. Their steering systems relied on wires and chains prone to jamming, and their very fine ends meant shipping green seas was common. They were a necessary stopgap, but required extensive time-consuming modifications just to be seaworthy. Amidst this chaos, the first glimmer of light appeared. The Admiralty, spurred by the need for surface detection, began fitting rudimentary radar. The Type 286 set, with its fixed aerial, was crude and susceptible to side lobes, but it was a start. By March 1941, about 90 escorts carried the set. More importantly, the concept of dedicated training took hold. At Tobermory, Commodore Stevenson initiated his intense, high-pressure work-up training. New ships and crews were subjected to 2 or 3 weeks of relentless close-order drill. Stevenson, known as the Terror of Tobermory, would board a new arrival before it was even moored and instantly declare a crisis. "Man overboard," he would shout, "ship on fire." Officers who failed to meet his stringent standards were instantly removed. The goal was to drill basic tasks like reloading the depth charge throwers until they were instinctive. This made the excruciating task of handling 400-pound charges on a slippery rolling deck slightly less impossible. The technological race found its first real success not with ASDI, but with the nascent radar. On March 17, 1941, the old destroyer HMS Snuck, one of the converted V and Ws, was escorting convoy HX-112. The night was dark, the sea running high. The radar operator, hunched over the glowing screen of his Type 286 set, saw a faint, persistent echo where there should have been only sea. It was U-100. commanded by the ace Joachim Schepke. The Vanoc, despite her reduced speed, closed the distance. The MO-100 was running on the surface, making her final approach. Schepke, acutely aware of his vulnerability, tried desperately to escape on the surface, and was too slow. The captain of the Vanoc ordered the charge to full speed. With a shuddering roar, the old destroyer bore down on the U-boat. There was no time for depth charges, no time for tactical finesse. The destroyer, built for torpedo attacks on battle fleets, was now a blunt instrument of destruction. The collision was horrific. The Vanoc slammed into U-100 amidships. The immense impact crushed the conning tower. Joachim Schepke, one of the greatest U-boat aces, was crushed against the periscope standard, instantly killed. It was a kill achieved not by the much-vaunted ASDIC, but by the raw, blunt force of an aging ship guided by a primitive radar set. It was a single bloody triumph in the vast green nightmare, but it was undeniable proof that the technology, the capability to see in the dark, was beginning to shift the balance. The long, brutal journey toward victory had begun. The technological war of 1941 was less a steady campaign and more a series of desperate, opportunistic leaps in the dark. The sinking of U-100 by the Vanoc in March had been a visceral, bloody indicator that radar held the key to defeating the U-boat's mastery of the night surface attack. But the greatest prize of the entire battle came 2 months later. It came not through force of arms, but by sheer astonishing luck. The date was May 9, 1940. Convoy OB-318 was struggling through the mid-Atlantic, shielded by a small escort group that included the destroyer HMS Bulldog. U-110, commanded by KPTLT Fritz Julius Lemp, was spotted on the surface. The escorts immediately converged, dropping a furious pattern of depth charges. The underwater explosions were concussive, shattering the silence within the U-boat's pressure hull. Lemp's boat, structurally compromised, shot uncontrollably to the surface. It broke the waves violently. The crew, believing the boat was doomed and about to sink, began scuttling procedures and abandoned ship. On the deck of the Bulldog, Sub-Lieutenant David Baum watched the chaos unfold. The U-boat was wallowing, half submerged, but clearly not sinking fast. The scuttling charges had failed to detonate properly. Balme realized the incredible opportunity before him. He quickly gathered a boarding party. They scrambled into a whaler and rowed across the choppy, oil-slicked water toward the enemy vessel. The tension was suffocating. Lemp was still alive, watching from the water, desperately trying to signal his men to return to the ship. But the boarding party was already clambering onto the slippery, barnacle-encrusted deck of U-110. They dropped down the hatch into the silent, reeking interior. The air inside was thick with diesel fumes and the metallic tang of seawater. Every surface was wet and slick. Baume and his men moved with frantic urgency. They ignored the charts and the logbooks. They were after the machine itself. Deep within the radio room, they found it. The German naval Enigma machine, complete with its rotors. Crucially, they also found the codebooks and the daily key settings. It was, in the cold, strategic language of war, the most important intelligence coup of the entire battle. Balme secured the materials, and the whaler pulled away, leaving the U-boat to finally slip beneath the waves. The impact of this capture was immediate and transformative. For the first time, Bletchley Park could read the German naval signals in real time. Donitz's operational orders were laid bare. The veil of secrecy was instantly ripped away. The Allies could now divert convoys around the wolf packs, effectively rendering the U-boat's carefully coordinated tactics obsolete. Rowe estimated that in the latter half of 1941 alone, this intelligence saved between 1.5 and 2 million tons of Allied shipping. The gleam of light had become a blinding flash of tactical superiority. This intelligence advantage was further amplified by the deployment of high-frequency direction finding, or HFDUF. U-boats coordinating their Wolfpack attacks relied heavily on HF radio transmissions. They needed to surface to send their reports and receive orders. Now, Allied escorts were equipped with sophisticated aerials, often vulnerable to icing and wind damage atop the foremast, that could instantly pinpoint the source of these transmissions. A single HFDF set could provide a rough bearing. A close transmission meant the U-boat was 15 to 20 miles away. Two sets, cross-referencing the bearing, could achieve an accurate location. The U-boats were, in effect, broadcasting their position every time they communicated. Commanders quickly grew suspicious, noting that attacks invariably followed their radio transmissions. The German High Command, obsessed with the theoretical threat of Allied radar, largely ignored the abundant evidence that their communications were being exploited. Forced to dive by the approaching escorts, the U-boats were robbed of their coordinated surface speed, that they were forced into the slow, blind world of submerged attack, where ASDIC still held the advantage. The technological edge was crystallizing, but it was not universal. In December 1941, the United States was dragged into the conflict. For the U-boats, this marked the beginning of their happy time. The contrast between the battle-hardened Royal Navy operations and the unpreparedness of the U.S. East Coast was shocking. The American coastal cities remained brightly lit, their skylines blazing against the night sky. Lighthouses and buoys burned as if it were peacetime. Merchant ships, still sailing independently, were silhouetted against the bright shore towns, offering U-boats immense operational freedom and success. Oberleutnant Sir C. Rudolph Arendt, patrolling off the coast of New Jersey in U-123, described the scene with incredulous delight. It was like shooting fish in a barrel. The lack of a coastal convoy system was a strategic oversight of staggering proportions, and the carnage was immediate. U-boats sank vast quantities of shipping, their operations facilitated by the Type 14 milch cows, U-tankers that extended their operational range across the Atlantic. The U.S. Navy scrambled to react. The desperate need for vessels led to the massive industrial ramp-up of U.S. shipbuilding. While the British struggled with labor shortages and restrictive union practices, the American system, utilizing prefabrication and sheer scale, began to churn out ships at an astonishing rate. By mid-1942, a full coastal convoy system was in operation and losses plummeted. The technological arms race, however, was about to take a grim turn. On February 1, 1942, the Germans introduced the four-rotor Enigma machine into the Atlantic Fleet. This Shark variant multiplied the possible solutions 26-fold. Bletchley Park, which had been reading the U-boat traffic with ease, was suddenly blinded. The intelligence advantage vanished overnight. The U-boats, now operating without fear of interception, returned to the North Atlantic with renewed ferocity. The Allies fought back with hardware. The Flower-class corvettes, for all their flaws, the perpetual condensation, the cramped mess decks, the violent rolling that made officers swear they would design better ships, were being supplemented by a new generation of ASW vessels. The wish list demanded better seakeeping and higher speed. The answer came in the form of the River-class frigates. Displacing 1855 tons, they were larger and more stable than the corvettes. Their ships were capable of 19.5 knots, and armed with two 4-inch guns and 10 20mm oerlikons. They represented a crucial balance, requiring only 2 engines. Unlike larger destroyers, thus avoiding the engine production bottleneck, even more capable were the Black Swan-class sloops, dubbed the Rolls-Royces of the escort force. They were larger, faster, and often equipped with the revolutionary Type 271 radar. The Type 271, born from the cavity magnetron, was a centimetric radar. It was a giant leap forward, allowing escorts to detect surfaced submarines at ranges of up to 7 miles stern-on. It could detect them at 4 miles even when only the conning tower was visible. It cut through the weather and the night, making the U-boat's surface advantage obsolete. But these new ships and weapons took time to arrive. In the interim, the crews of the older vessels, the V and Ws and the Flowers, endured. They fought on through the psychological darkness of the time. They knew the enemy could read their codes and that the night still belonged to the U-boat. They fought with the constant nauseating movement of their small ships, the shuddering of the hull as it slammed into a heavy sea, and the knowledge that structural failure was as likely to kill them as a torpedo. The battle had shifted from a simple hunt to a complex technological chess match. The Allies had tasted the power of intelligence and centimetric detection. The Germans had countered by reinforcing their communications security. Now, in early 1942, as the U-boats ravaged the American coast, the Allies were once again fighting blind. They were relying on the sheer tenacity of their crews and the slow, grinding output of the shipyards to survive the renewed onslaught. The dark hours were far from over. The turning point of the Battle of the Atlantic arrived in a fury of ice, spray, and shattering noise during the early months of 1943. This was the climax. It was the period known as the critical convoy battles of March 1943. The U-boat threat peaked, and the Allies were forced to commit everything they had to prevent strategic collapse. The critical struggle unfolded around convoys HX-2219 and SC-122. 52 merchant ships were steaming eastward, protected by only a thin screen of escorts, including the veteran V&W destroyer HMS Highlander. Donitz, now fully utilizing the restored secrecy of the four-rotor Enigma, knew exactly where the convoys were. They amassed the largest wolf pack of the war, nearly 40 U-boats, to strike simultaneously. On the bridge of the Highlander, Commander Frank W. Price leaned into the gale. The wind tore at his oilskins. The weather was a constant, vicious adversary, characterized by low cloud, visibility down to less than 2 miles, and a high, confused sea. The radar operator reported detection ranges were down to barely 3,000 yards due to the conditions. Price could taste the salt and the tension of that filthy, brutal morning. The first attack came out of the weather. A staggered line of U-boats surfaced at night, relying on their GHG hydrophones to pinpoint the sound of the convoy's propellers. The escorts, spread thin across the ocean, were instantly overwhelmed. Inside the ASDIC hut, the air was hot and claustrophobic, smelling of ozone and unwashed bodies. Petty Officer Thomas Davies, glued to his Type 124 set, fought the noise of the sea and the ship's own machinery. The ASDIC pinged into the green depths. Ping, ding, ding, ping. The sound echoed back, distorted by the thermal layers in the water. Suddenly, a solid echo registered at a range of 2,500 yards. Contact! Submerged! Bearing 040, Davies shouted, his voice cracking from sheer exhaustion. The Highlander peeled away from the convoy, her engines protesting as Price pushed her to maximum speed. The pursuit was agonizingly slow. The U-boat, a Type 7C, was running deep, far below the 100-meter safe depth. Its captain knew that a structural collapse was preferable to being caught within the lethal radius of a Mark 7 depth charge. Price understood the limitations of their weapons. The Mark 7 depth charge had a sinking rate of only 7 feet per second, creating an agonizing, dead time where the escort was blind and the U-boat could maneuver. They had to hit the U-boat precisely, but the ASDIC could not provide depth. They ordered a pattern drop. The twin rails on the quarterdeck released their 400-pound charges with a metallic clatter. The ship surged forward, and the charges sank. 1 minute, 2 minutes of silence, then the muffled thump, thump of the explosions below. Price waited, his heart hammering against his ribs.
"Any debris? Any noise?" he demanded.
"Negative, sir. Lost contact." The U-boat had slipped away once more. Over the next 4 days, the battle was relentless. The wolf pack, constantly guided by Donitz's radio signals, tore into the convoys, but the escorts fought back with grim determination. The Black Swan sloops, known as the Rolls-Royces of the escort force, were finally arriving in numbers. They were equipped with the technology that would change the war, the Hedgehog. The Hedgehog, a spigot mortar that fired a salvo of 24 30-pound bombs ahead of the ship, was the direct answer to the fatal flaw of the depth charge. Because it fired forward, the escort could maintain continuous ASDIC contact until the very moment of firing. And because the charge was contact-fused, there was no ambiguous bang from a near miss. If it hit, on HMS Starling, Captain Frederick John Walker, the tactical genius of the 2nd Escort Group, was perfecting his methods. Walker, an ace U-boat killer, had pioneered the concept of the integrated support group and the devastating creeping attack. This tactic involved one ship maintaining ASDIC contact while others, guided by the first, positioned themselves for a perfect depth charge run or a lethal Hedgehog salvo. Walker's relentless pursuit was fueled by the intelligence flowing again from Bletchley Park. They had finally overcome the four-rotor Enigma. The combination of high-frequency direction finding, or HF/DF, giving them the initial location, Enigma telling them the route, and centimetric radar, ASV3, giving them sight in the dark, created a tightening noose around the wolf packs. The ASV3, it operated on a 10-centimeter wavelength. Crucially, the German U-boats, still relying on their primitive Metox radar detectors, were completely blind to it. The Metox receiver, a bulky, unreliable piece of equipment, could only detect older meta-wavelength radar. The U-boats would surface in the darkness, believing themselves safe, only to be ambushed by an Allied escort whose bridge was illuminated by the crisp, clear echo of their conning tower. This technological superiority, a system of integrated sensors and ahead-throwing weapons, was devastatingly effective. During the March battles, 21 merchant ships were lost, a harrowing toll. But the escorts, fighting with newfound coordination and lethality, sank or damaged 10 U-boats. The ratio had finally shifted. For the first time, the cost to the U-boat command was strategically unsustainable. Donitz, receiving the crippling reports of losses, was in denial. He believed the problem lay not with technology, but with the courage of his commanders, issuing a desperate signal to his boats, attack with more determination. The reality was that his captains, many of whom were inexperienced following the strategic era of cutting training programs, were simply facing a wall of coordinated, technologically superior defense. The final decisive blow came 2 months later, in May 1943. The losses accelerated into a slaughter. In the final weeks of May, U-boat sinkings reached catastrophic levels. Relentless air patrols, now equipped with ASV-3 centimetric radar, hunted the U-boats even in the Bay of Biscay. Donitz had ordered them to cross-surfaced by day there, believing they could fight off the obsolescent Allied aircraft. But the air attacks alone accounted for nearly 2/3 of all U-boat losses during this period. On May 24, 1943, the weight of the evidence became unbearable. The operational costs were too high, the success rate too low. Donitz, the architect of the Wolfpack strategy, was forced to confront the impossible. He ordered the withdrawal of all U-boats from the North Atlantic. The order was quiet and clinical, but its effect was thunderous. The great offensive threat, the weapon that had brought Britain to the verge of starvation, was beaten. The Wolfpacks dissolved, scattering to less critical theatres. The sea lanes were finally open. The Battle of the Atlantic, the longest and most brutal engagement of the war, was won not by a single ship or a single technology. It was won by the devastating synergy of centimetric radar, HF/DF, Hedgehog, and the tactical brilliance of commanders like Walker. Their crews, enduring the perpetual misery of their cramped, rolling vessels, had finally mastered the grueling green nightmare. The withdrawal of the U-boats in May 1943 was the definitive moment. The war for the supply lines was over, and the path for the eventual invasion of Europe was secured. The withdrawal of the U-boats from the North Atlantic in May 1943 was not the end of the Battle of the Atlantic. It was the decisive turning point, a strategic surrender of the critical sea lanes. The Allies, having finally secured the initiative, shifted entirely to an offensive hunting posture. The technological advantage, once fragmented and experimental, had matured into a complete, integrated system designed for one purpose: destruction. The culmination of this technological evolution was demonstrated in September 1943. The Castle-class corvette, HMS Hadley Castle, arrived in the United States. She was a showcase, a floating testament to the hard-won lessons of the war. American naval officers, accustomed to their own impressive industrial output, toured the ship, examining the integrated anti-submarine warfare suite. What the American officers saw was not merely a collection of independent widgets, it was a fully coherent, integrated system of destruction. The Type 271M centimetric radar, spinning its antenna high above the waves, gave the Hadley Castle the power to see the smallest surface target, even in the heaviest weather. The HAF/DF aerial, perched precariously on the mast, pulled the U-boat's radio transmissions right out of the ether. This gave the hunters a precise bearing before the German commander even knew he was being tracked. But the real marvel sat waiting on the foredeck. This was the Squid, the ultimate evolution of the ahead-throwing weapon. Unlike the Hedgehog, which required a contact fuse, the Squid was a mortar system that fired 3 massive 390-pound projectiles. These projectiles were set to explode at a precise depth, a depth continuously calculated and updated by the Type 147 ASDIC. This was the first anti-submarine warfare sonar capable of providing truly accurate depth measurement. The ASDIC operator was no longer guessing. He was directing a pre-programmed kill. The US Navy was profoundly impressed by this seamless integration. This was the final piece of the puzzle they needed to perfect their own anti-submarine warfare efforts. The British readily shared the technology, transferring dozens of the advanced ASDIC and Squid systems to their American and Canadian counterparts. This cemented the unified technological front that would dominate the final years of the war. Facing this overwhelming technological superiority, the Germans attempted a frantic catch-up effort. Their answer was the T5 Zonkonig, or GNAT, the German naval acoustic torpedo. This was a homing torpedo specifically designed to target the noise of an escort's propellers. Traveling at 25 knots in a sinuous path, it was a terrifying weapon. It was capable of wrecking a ship's stern, bending propellers, and violently buckling the upper deck. The T5 made its lethal debut against convoys on 202 and ONS-18 in September 1943. U-boat commanders launched the new weapon with high, desperate hopes. But the Allies had already developed a simple countermeasure. It was called the Foxer decoy. Aboard the escorts, the Foxer was a simple but brilliant solution. It was a noisy towed device designed to create anywhere from 10 to 100 times the propeller noise of the ship itself. The T5, programmed to home in on the loudest sound, immediately veered away from the escort. It chased the decoy to a harmless detonation. The frustrated U-boat crews could only watch as their sophisticated secret weapon proved largely ineffective against evasive maneuvers and the sheer cacophony of the Foxer. Though the noise of the decoy severely degraded the escort's own ASDIC performance, the immediate tactical threat of the GNAT was neutralized. Admiral Donitz, starved of success in the Atlantic, poured every remaining resource into revolutionary new designs, the Type 21 and Type 23 U-boats. These were the true submarines of the future, designed not to surface, but to fight and live entirely submerged. The Type 21, with its massive battery and double-pressure hull, was a technological marvel. It aimed for 17 knots submerged and a crushing depth of 330 meters.
But these advances came far, far too late.
The Type 21 was too complex to mass-produce efficiently, requiring unprecedented levels of skilled labor. It suffered from constant teething troubles, including faulty hydraulic systems prone to leaks and seawater contamination. Despite 120 boats being delivered in 2 years, tragically few ever reached operational patrols. The war for the Atlantic had already been lost on the surface. The final victory was secured by the sheer, overwhelming industrial capacity of the Allies. Canadian shipyards became a vital contributor, overcoming initial quality issues like brittle bolts and poorly aligned crankshafts. But this process still took months longer than their US counterparts. Ultimately, it was the industrial might of the United States that proved decisive. The US mass production of destroyer escorts, known as DEs, was staggering. Bethlehem Hingham, employing 23,000 workers at its peak, was laying down and launching vessels at speeds unimaginable in Europe, as these new DEs, like the Captain and Colony classes transferred to the Royal Navy, provided the quantitative advantage. They simply drowned the U-boat threat in sheer numbers. Royal Navy crews, stepping aboard the American-built Colony-class frigates, found them luxurious by comparison. They featured laundries, ice water dispensers, and even dishwashers. This was a stark contrast to the Flower-class mess decks, where condensation was so heavy that lockers were perpetually drenched. Yet even with these improved vessels, the fight remained a primal struggle against the environment. It was, in the words of one veteran, a war fought against nature itself. Crews still battled the nauseating movement of ships with high metacentric heights. Reloading depth-charge throwers in a sea state 6 gale was always a dangerous gamble. The 400-pound charges were sometimes lobbed vertically upwards right back onto the quarterdeck, but the constant rolling, the bone-chilling cold, and the violent shuddering of hulls during slamming contributed as much to the exhaustion and operational limits of the crews as the enemy ever did. The final somber act of the Battle of the Atlantic came after Germany's surrender. In the frigid waters off Northern Ireland, the remaining U-boat fleet was gathered for Operation Deadlight. 116 U-boats, the symbols of the devastating peril that had nearly choked the Allied war effort, were towed out and scuttled as the last Type 7C slipped beneath the waves. The longest and most decisive conflict of World War II reached its conclusion. It was a victory secured not by a single weapon, but by the relentless adaptive synergy of technology and the crushing scale of American industrial power. Above all, it was secured by the enduring courage of the merchant seamen and the escort crews. They had sailed through the darkest hours, ensuring that the critical flow of troops and material necessary for the defeat of the Axis powers reached Europe. The vast green sea of the western approaches had swallowed nearly 50,000 souls on both sides. This remains the profound and terrible legacy of the battle that ultimately secured the world. If you value these historical accounts, please subscribe to the channel and like this video. It helps us preserve these stories, and please share your own memories or thoughts in the comments below.